The annual Meridian Tech Family Picnic was supposed to be one of those rare, carefully choreographed corporate bonding events where the company traded conference rooms for picnic blankets and PowerPoint slides for paper plates. The sprawling park chosen for the event looked like it had been plucked from a glossy brochure. Endless green lawns, white tents lined with buffet tables, children's laughter riding the summer air, and company banners flapping lazily in the warm breeze. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs hung thick, mingling with the sweetness of cotton candy from the rented stand. Groups of employees clustered under shade trees, some balancing plastic cups of beer, others awkwardly introducing spouses and children to colleagues who'd only ever been names in an inbox. For one Saturday, at least, Meridian Tech pretended to be a family. I wasn't here for the camaraderie. I was here because of Tommy. My 5-year-old son's eyes widened as we walked past the balloon arch marking the entrance. His small hand clung tightly to mine, his favorite superhero t-shirt already stained with chocolate from the cookie he'd begged for on the drive over. The tiny backpack on his shoulders rattled with the weight of his toy cars, a collection he insisted other kids would definitely want to see. "Dad, is this where you work?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "Not exactly here, buddy," I chuckled, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "But with these people, this is where Daddy spends his days." He nodded solemnly, as if filing that away as an important fact, before spotting the playground. His face lit up, and in a blink he was racing off with the kind of energy adults can only envy. He was soon joined by Sarah, my colleague Jake's 7-year-old daughter, and within minutes their laughter blended seamlessly with the rest of the children's chorus. I let myself breathe, sinking into one of the picnic tables near the playground, surrounded by familiar faces from IT. Mark from the database team was halfway into a story about our upcoming system migration, gesturing with a plastic cup like a professor at a chalkboard. Even here, surrounded by beer kegs and frisbees, technical talk was inevitable. That's when a voice cut through the chatter like the snap of a whip. "Well, well, look who decided to grace us with his presence." The words hit me before I even saw him. Charles Morrison, Vice President of Operations, my direct supervisor, a man whose polished smile was less an expression and more a weapon, honed and sharpened over decades of corporate survival. He approached with a predator's swagger, his perfectly tailored polo and pressed khakis looking absurdly out of place among grass stains and juice boxes. His silver hair caught the sunlight like a crown. His smirk, as always, was aimed downward. "Hello, Charles," I said evenly, rising to my feet more out of conditioned reflex than respect. "Enjoying the picnic?" "Oh, I'm having a wonderful time, David," he replied, drawing out my name like it tasted sour on his tongue. "Though I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you here. I figured you'd be too busy with your little side projects to bother showing up." A murmur rippled across the table. There it was, the jab, aimed not just at me but at my dignity. He was referring to my weekend consulting work, the extra income I used to pay for Tommy's preschool to build the foundation of a college fund, work I had done transparently, with HR's approval, never once interfering with my duties at Meridian Tech. And yet, here it was, turned into a public spear. "The consulting doesn't interfere with my responsibilities here," I said, my voice steady, though my heart rate had ticked upward. "HR cleared it long ago." Charles leaned in, smile widening. It wasn't warmth. It was a performance, an audience-capturing grin designed to humiliate. Of course. I'm sure a single father like yourself needs all the extra cash he can scrape together. Must be tough trying to properly provide for your son on just your salary." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because they were aimed where it hurt most, delivered loud enough for colleagues and their families at nearby tables to hear. I noticed the shift. Forks pausing over plates, conversations faltering, eyes darting downward. Tommy's laugh carried from the swings. He was oblivious to what was happening. My son. The reason I worked late nights, the reason I took on extra clients, the reason I tolerated men like Charles. And here, in broad daylight, Charles tried to turn that reason into a weakness. "We're doing just fine, thank you," I said, forcing calm into every syllable, though a knot tightened in my stomach. "Are you, though?" Charles's tone rose, meant to travel across tables, meant to draw ears. He gestured broadly to the catered buffet, the open bar, the inflated play castle where children shrieked with joy. I mean, look at this spread. Open bar, live entertainment. This, his hand swept over the park. This is what success looks like, David. This is what you get when you're truly valuable to an organization, not just adequate. He let the word hang in the air like a stench. Adequate. I could feel the eyes of my peers burning into me, some filled with sympathy, others with discomfort, all too afraid to intervene. Charles's smirk widened. He was feeding off the silence, off the humiliation. And then I felt a tug on my shirt. Dad? I looked down. Tommy stood beside me, clutching his toy car in one hand, confusion etched on his face. His voice carried, unfiltered, innocent. Dad? Why did he say that to you? The world seemed to freeze. The murmurs stopped. Even Charles blinked, taken aback by the purity of the question. My son's wide eyes searched mine, demanding an answer. I turned back to Charles, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. The smirk was still there. But now I saw the flicker of uncertainty behind it. I crouched down to Tommy's level, resting a hand on his shoulder. My voice was calm, deliberate, but edged with something cold. I don't know, son, I said, locking eyes with Charles as the words cut through the silence. But I'll find out, and he'll regret it. Other conversations around us were stopping now. Forks clinked softly against paper plates. Drinks were left untouched, and people pretended to be interested in their coleslaw while leaning ever so slightly closer to hear. This was exactly the kind of public spectacle Charles thrived on, dragging someone into the spotlight of embarrassment to remind everyone else that he was untouchable. It wasn't enough for him to win quietly. He needed an audience. He needed the humiliation to echo. Daddy! Tommy's voice cut through the tension like a firecracker, bright and innocent. He came barreling toward me from the playground, cheeks flushed, his toy car still clutched in one hand. Did you see how high I went? I went higher than Sarah. He skidded to a stop beside me, breathless, his eyes shining with pride. For a moment, the heaviness pressing down on my chest lifted. Those bright blue eyes, Jenny's eyes, looked up at me, expectant and full of joy. Jenny had been gone 3 years now, taken from us in a car accident that had shattered everything. Raising Tommy alone had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. Harder than any deadline. Harder than any fight with management. But his smile, his laugh, they were what pulled me through the nights when grief had threatened to swallow me whole. That's great, buddy, I said, bending down to ruffle his hair. You're getting stronger every day. I'm proud of you. The moment should have been ours, but Charles couldn't allow that. He tilted his head down toward Tommy, the same condescending smirk curling his lips. And this must be your son, he said slowly, as though appraising a flawed piece of merchandise. He's smaller than I expected for a 5-year-old. The words hit me like a slap. My jaw tightened. Tommy wasn't small at all. He was tall for his age, active, strong. But the truth didn't matter to Charles. He wasn't making an observation. He was making a statement, a calculated one. He'd found another angle to dig at, another way to slice at me through the most vulnerable part of my life. My child. Tommy's perfectly healthy, I said, each word clipped and harder than I intended, my voice gaining an edge despite my efforts to remain composed. Oh, I'm sure he is, Charles continued smoothly, oozing false concern. It's just that proper nutrition can be so expensive these days. And with your extracurricular work, well, I imagine it must be difficult to provide him the very best, wouldn't you agree? He crouched down, lowering himself to Tommy's eye level. His smile widened into something grotesque. Fake friendly, the kind of tone adults use when talking to children they don't care about. Your daddy works very hard, doesn't he, Tommy? Though between us. Charles lowered his voice just enough that everyone leaned forward to catch it. Some people work harder than others. Tommy's brows knit together in confusion. At 5 years old, he couldn't understand the underhanded cruelty being lobbed at me, but he could feel the weight of it. He looked up at me, silently asking if he had done something wrong, if I had done something wrong. And that was the part that cut deeper than any insult Charles could craft. Charles straightened again, dusting imaginary dirt from his khakis, his eyes glinting as he scanned the faces around us. He wasn't talking to just me anymore. He was performing for the entire picnic. His voice rose, carrying over the tables, past the buffet line, into the playground where other parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "You know, David," he said, drawing out my name like a judge pronouncing a sentence, "I've been giving some serious thought to our department restructuring. Times are tight, budgets are strained, and we can't afford to carry dead weight anymore. We need to focus on our essential personnel, the ones fully committed to the company, not distracted by outside interests." The meaning behind his words was a knife pressed to my throat. He wasn't just humiliating me for sport anymore. He was broadcasting my job's fragility for all to hear. Every colleague within earshot now knew exactly what Charles thought of me, and that my position was hanging by a thread. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about my performance," I said carefully, forcing steel into my voice. "My reviews have been consistently excellent. I've never missed a deadline, and I've never failed to meet expectations." Charles let out a laugh, sharp and dismissive, the kind that echoed and lingered like a cough in a quiet room. "Oh, your performance is adequate, David. Perfectly adequate. But adequacy isn't what we're looking for in leadership positions, is it?" He spread his arms wide, gesturing toward the catered buffet, the balloon arches, the open bar, the glossy entertainment he'd personally insisted on funding for the event. "This is what success looks like. This is the image we want for our company. People who inspire confidence, who command respect, who belong at events like this. Not those who—" His eyes swept me up and down, seemed so very out of place. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt every pair of eyes on me, not one colleague daring to speak up, not one voice raised to push back against him. But then, I felt Tommy's small hand slip into mine, gripping tight. I looked down and saw his wide, questioning eyes. He didn't fully understand, but he knew. He knew his father was being attacked. And right there, in that moment, I made a silent promise. Charles thought he'd humiliated me. He thought he'd carved his little victory into my skin for everyone to see. But he didn't understand yet. The show had just begun. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several of my colleagues were now openly staring, some with sympathy in their eyes, others with the uncomfortable fascination that people have when witnessing someone else's humiliation. Tommy tugged at my shirt. "Dad, why is he talking to you like that? You're the smartest person I know." The innocent question from my son hit me like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes. Tommy had cut right to the heart of it. Charles was belittling me, and my 5-year-old son was witnessing it. Charles's smirk widened at Tommy's words. "Well, isn't that sweet? Though I suppose children often have unrealistic impressions of their parents. It's natural for a boy to think his father is the smartest, the strongest, the most successful, even when reality suggests otherwise." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Insulting me was one thing, but involving my son, making him question his faith in his father, was crossing a line that should never be crossed. I looked Charles directly in the eyes, my voice steady but carrying a tone I'd never used with him before. "I think this conversation has run its course, Charles." "Has it? I was just getting started." He looked down at Tommy again. "You know, son, your father and I were just discussing his future with the company. It's important for you to understand that not everyone is cut out for success. Some people are just, well, let's say they have limitations." Tommy's eyes filled with confusion and the beginning of tears. He pressed closer to my leg, looking up at me with an expression that would haunt me for the rest of my life if I didn't handle this correctly. "Dad," Tommy whispered, his voice small and uncertain. "Why did he say that to you?" I knelt down to Tommy's level, putting my hands on his shoulders while keeping my eyes locked on Charles. When I spoke, my voice was calm but carried a promise that anyone who knew me well would recognize as dangerous. "I don't know, son," I said clearly, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "But I'll find out, and he'll regret it." Charles laughed, apparently delighted by what he perceived as an empty threat. "Oh, David, always so dramatic. I'm sure we can discuss this more productively back at the office on Monday." I stood up, lifting Tommy into my arms. "Come on, buddy, let's go get some ice cream and play some games. The grown-ups are done talking." As I carried my son toward the dessert station, I could hear Charles behind me, probably making some additional comment to his audience about my outburst or unprofessional behavior. But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was already shifting into a different mode, one I hadn't accessed since my military days before I'd become a software developer. Charles had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed that my calm demeanor and professional courtesy indicated weakness. He'd assumed that my focus on being a good father meant I couldn't or wouldn't fight back when pushed too far. Most importantly, he'd assumed that I didn't have any leverage to use against him. All of those assumptions were wrong. Over the next hour, I went through the motions of enjoying the picnic with Tommy. We got ice cream, played carnival games, and I cheered enthusiastically as he won a small stuffed animal at the ring toss. But part of my mind was already working, reviewing 8 years of observations, conversations, and access to company systems. "Dad, are you okay?" Tommy asked as we sat on a bench, sharing a cotton candy that was probably 90% sugar. "I'm fine, buddy. Are you having fun?" "Yeah, but..." He paused, pulling apart the pink confection with his small fingers. "That man was mean to you." "Yes, he was." "Why was he mean?" I considered how to explain workplace bullying to a 5-year-old. Sometimes grown-ups say mean things because they're unhappy about something inside themselves. It doesn't have anything to do with the person they're being mean to. "But you're not gonna let him be mean anymore, right?" I looked into my son's trusting eyes, seeing both innocence and a faith in me that I couldn't bear to disappoint. "No, buddy, I'm not gonna let him be mean anymore." That night, after Tommy was asleep, I sat in my home office with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. Over the years, as senior systems analyst, I'd had access to a wide range of company data and communications. I'd seen budget reports, email chains between executives, and system logs that most employees never even knew existed. More importantly, I'd been the person who'd implemented most of Meridian Tech's current database and security systems. I knew where information was stored, how to access it legally, and what patterns to look for when trying to understand the bigger picture of company operations. What I found over the next few hours was illuminating. Charles Morrison, it turned out, had been playing some very dangerous games with company resources. As Vice President of Operations, he had approval authority for contracts up to $500,000. Over the past 2 years, he'd been consistently awarding contracts to a consulting firm called Morrison Solutions LLC. The name similarity wasn't a coincidence. A quick search of public business records showed that Morrison Solutions LLC was owned by one Margaret Morrison, Charles's wife. This wasn't necessarily illegal, but it was definitely a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed to the board of directors. Company policy clearly stated that any business relationships between employees and vendors needed to be reported and approved through the compliance department. But it got worse. Looking at the actual work performed by Morrison Solutions, I found a pattern of inflated invoices, vague deliverables, and projects that seemed to serve no real business purpose. Over 2 years, Charles had essentially funneled over $800,000 in company money to his wife's consulting firm. I spent the weekend documenting everything I'd found, creating a comprehensive report with supporting evidence and cross-references. By Sunday evening, I had a 40-page document that detailed what appeared to be systematic embezzlement disguised as legitimate consulting contracts. But I didn't send it to anyone yet. Charles had taught me something valuable over the years. Timing was everything in corporate warfare. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly. Typical Seattle weather that matched my mood as I walked into the Meridian Tech offices. I went through my normal routine, checking emails, attending the weekly team meeting, updating project status reports. To anyone watching, I appeared to be having a perfectly ordinary day. Charles, for his part, seemed to be in an excellent mood. He made a point of stopping by my desk around 10 o'clock, coffee in hand and that familiar smirk on his face. David, I hope you had a good weekend to think about our conversation on Friday. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings about expectations going forward. Actually, Charles, I did spend some time thinking about our conversation and about expectations. Excellent. I knew you'd see reason. You're a smart man, David, even if you don't always make the smartest choices. I looked up at him from my computer screen. Speaking of smart choices, I've been curious about something. How do you decide which consulting firms to use for our operational projects? Charles's smile flickered slightly. What do you mean? Well, I've been reviewing some of our vendor relationships as part of the systems audit, and I noticed we've been using Morrison Solutions LLC quite extensively. They must do excellent work to get so many contracts. Yes, well, they're very reliable. Cost-effective too. That's interesting. I'd love to learn more about how you evaluate cost-effectiveness. Maybe we could discuss it in more detail sometime this week. Charles studied my face, looking for signs of what I might know or suspect. I'm not sure what you're getting at, David. Oh, nothing specific. Just trying to understand best practices for vendor management. You know how it is. Always looking to improve processes. I turned back to my computer, dismissing him with the same casual indifference he'd shown me and countless other employees over the years. Charles stood there for a moment, clearly unsettled by the change in dynamic, then walked away without another word. The rest of Monday and Tuesday passed quietly. I continued my normal work while putting the finishing touches on my documentation. I also made some discreet inquiries about company whistleblower policies and consulted with a lawyer friend about the legal implications of what I'd discovered. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. I was walking past the executive conference room when I overheard raised voices. Through the slightly open door, I could see Charles in heated discussion with Margaret Stevens, the CEO, and Robert Kim, the Chief Financial Officer. The numbers don't add up, Charles, Margaret was saying. Our operational consulting costs have increased by 40% over 2 years, but I'm not seeing corresponding improvements in efficiency or output. These are complex projects, Charles replied, his voice tighter than usual. Sometimes the benefits aren't immediately visible in quarterly reports. $800,000 over 2 years, Charles. That's not pocket change. I need detailed justifications for these expenditures, and I need them by Friday. This was perfect timing. Margaret was already asking the right questions. She just needed someone to provide the right answers. That afternoon, I requested a private meeting with Margaret Stevens. Her assistant scheduled me for Thursday at 3 o'clock, coincidentally the same time as the weekly executive staff meeting that Charles would be attending. Thursday at 3 p.m., I sat across from Margaret in her corner office, a manila folder containing my research resting on my lap. David, thank you for coming. Your message said you had some concerns about operational procedures? Yes, ma'am. I've discovered what appears to be a serious conflict of interest involving vendor relationships. I handed her the folder and waited while she opened it and began reading. Margaret was a sharp businesswoman in her late 40s who'd built Meridian Tech from a small startup into a successful mid-sized company. She hadn't gotten where she was by being naive about corporate politics or financial improprieties. As she read through my documentation, her expression grew increasingly serious. After about 10 minutes, she looked up at me with the kind of focused intensity that had probably terrified competitors and employees alike over the years. This is very thorough work, David. How did you come across this information? I've been conducting routine systems audits as part of our security protocols. The patterns became apparent when I started cross-referencing vendor payments with project deliverables. And you're certain about these connections? The business relationship between Charles Morrison and Morrison Solutions LLC? Yes, ma'am. Everything is documented with public records and internal communications that I've preserved according to our data retention policies. Margaret closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. David, this is potentially very serious. If your analysis is correct, we're looking at a significant breach of fiduciary duty and company policy. I understand the gravity of the situation. That's why I felt it was important to bring it to your attention directly. Have you discussed this with anyone else? No, ma'am. Given the sensitive nature of the information, I thought it was appropriate to follow the chain of command. Margaret nodded approvingly. That was the right call. I'm going to need to involve our legal team and possibly external auditors. Are you prepared to provide additional documentation if needed? Absolutely. And David, I want you to know that the company takes whistleblower protections very seriously. Your job security will not be affected by coming forward with this information. As I walked back to my desk, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The wheels were now in motion, and there would be no going back. But I thought about Tommy's question at the picnic. Why was he mean to you? And I knew I'd made the right choice. Friday morning brought the reckoning. I was at my desk, working on a routine database update, when I saw Charles being escorted to Margaret's office by two people I didn't recognize, probably lawyers or investigators. His face was pale, and his usual confident swagger had been replaced by the uncertain gait of someone who just realized they were in serious trouble. About an hour later, the entire company received an email from Margaret announcing that Charles Morrison was taking an immediate leave of absence for personal reasons, and that his duties would be temporarily assumed by the CFO pending a restructuring of the operations department. The office buzz was immediate and intense. Charles hadn't been popular, but he'd been a fixture in the company for over 6 years. His sudden disappearance sent ripples of speculation and concern throughout the organization. Around lunchtime, I received a call from Margaret's assistant asking me to come to the CEO's office. When I arrived, I found Margaret with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the company's outside counsel. David, we've completed our preliminary review of the documentation you provided, Margaret began. I want to personally thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. Your diligence has potentially saved the company from significant financial and legal exposure. I'm glad I could help. Based on our investigation, we'll be terminating Charles Morrison's employment immediately and pursuing legal action to recover the misappropriated funds. We're also implementing new oversight procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. The lawyer leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, we may need you to provide testimony if this matter goes to court. Are you prepared for that possibility? Yes, sir. I believe in doing the right thing. Margaret smiled. The first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her in the 8 years I'd worked at Meridian Tech. David, I've also been reviewing your personnel file and performance evaluations. It's clear that your talents have been underutilized in your current role. I felt my pulse quicken. Ma'am, I'd like to offer you Charles's position, VP of Operations, with a 40% salary increase and full management authority over the department. The offer hit me like a thunderbolt. VP of Operations, the same position that Charles had used to humiliate me just a week earlier. That's very generous, Margaret, but I want to make sure this promotion is based on my qualifications, not just on my role in exposing Charles's misconduct. David, I've spent the past week reviewing your work history, talking to your colleagues, and examining your contributions to this company. You've consistently performed at a level well above your job description. The only reason you weren't promoted years ago was because Charles blocked every recommendation that came across his desk. That revelation hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd wondered why my career had seemed stagnant despite my strong performance. Now I understood. Charles had been actively sabotaging my advancement, probably because he saw me as a threat to his own position. There's one more thing, Margaret continued. We're implementing a new policy requiring all vendor relationships to be reviewed and approved by a committee rather than a single individual. I'd like you to chair that committee as part of your new responsibilities. I accepted the promotion, of course. That evening, as I drove home to tell Tommy the good news, I reflected on the events of the past week. Charles had tried to humiliate me in front of my son, to make me feel small and powerless. Instead, he'd awakened something in me that I'd kept buried for too long. The willingness to fight back when fighting was necessary. Tommy was in the living room, playing with his toy cars and making elaborate crash scenes with appropriate sound effects. Hey, buddy, I said, sitting down on the floor beside him. Remember that man who was mean to Daddy at the picnic? Tommy looked up from his cars, his expression suddenly serious. The mean man? Yes, the mean man. Well, it turns out he was doing some very bad things at Daddy's work. And because I told the truth about what he was doing, he can't work there anymore. Good, Tommy said with the fierce certainty that only children possess. Mean people shouldn't be allowed to be mean to good people? That's right, buddy. And guess what? Because I did the right thing, I got promoted. That means I have a more important job now, and we'll have more money for things like your college fund and maybe some nice vacations. Tommy abandoned his cars and climbed into my lap. Dad, are you sad that he was mean to you? I thought about that question. Was I sad, angry, vindicated? All of those emotions were swirling around inside me, but the dominant feeling was something else entirely. No, buddy, I'm not sad. I'm proud. Proud of what? Proud that my son saw me stand up for what's right. Proud that when someone tried to make us feel bad, we didn't let them win. And proud that you're learning that sometimes you have to fight back against bullies, but you do it the right way. With truth and courage, not with meanness. Tommy nodded solemnly, as if he understood the deeper implications of what I was saying. Then, with the resilience that children possess in abundance, he picked up one of his cars and went back to his elaborate crash scenarios. That weekend, I took Tommy to the same park where the company picnic had been held. We played on the swings where he'd been so happy just a week earlier, before Charles's cruelty had cast a shadow over our day. "Push me higher, Dad," Tommy called out, pumping his legs with determination. As I pushed his swing, watching him soar higher and higher with fearless joy, I thought about the lessons we'd both learned that week. Tommy had seen his father humiliated, but he'd also seen him fight back with dignity and strength. He'd learned that bullies don't always win, that truth has power, and that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage. For myself, I'd learned that 8 years of quiet professionalism hadn't been wasted time. Every system I'd implemented, every relationship I'd built, every piece of knowledge I'd accumulated had prepared me for the moment when I needed to defend not just my own dignity, but my son's faith in his father. Charles Morrison had tried to teach my son that his father was weak, unsuccessful, and unworthy of respect. Instead, he'd provided the catalyst for me to demonstrate the opposite. That strength doesn't always announce itself with loud voices and public displays, but sometimes works quietly and methodically until the moment when it's needed most. A week later, I received an email from Charles's personal account. It was brief and professional. "David, I wanted to congratulate you on your promotion. I also wanted to apologize for my behavior at the company picnic. My comments were inappropriate and unprofessional. I hope you'll accept my apologies. Best wishes for your success in your new role. Charles." I stared at that email for a long time, considering how to respond. The old David might have written back immediately, accepting the apology graciously and perhaps even offering some words of encouragement for Charles's future endeavors. But I wasn't the old David anymore. Charles's apology, while appreciated, came only after he'd been caught and punished. It was motivated by consequences, not by genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. I deleted the email without responding. 3 months later, I was settling into my new role as Vice President of Operations when Margaret called me into her office for my first quarterly review. "David, I have to say, the transformation in the operations department has been remarkable. Employee satisfaction is up, vendor costs are down, and project delivery times have improved significantly." "Thank you. I've been focusing on building better relationships with both our team and our external partners." "It shows. I've also heard excellent feedback about your leadership style. Several employees have mentioned that they feel more supported and valued than they have in years." I thought about that feedback as I drove home that evening. Leadership, I'd learned, wasn't about making people feel small to make yourself feel big. It was about lifting others up, creating an environment where everyone could do their best work, and taking responsibility for both successes and failures. That night, as I was tucking Tommy into bed, he looked up at me with those serious blue eyes that always seemed to see more than a 5-year-old should. "Dad, do you like your new job better?" "Yes, buddy, I do." "Because the mean man is gone?" "Partly because the mean man is gone, but mostly because I get to help make things better for the people I work with. Just like you help make things better for me by being such a good son." Tommy smiled at that, satisfied with the explanation. As I turned off his bedroom light, he called out one more time, "Dad?" "Yes, buddy? I'm proud of you too." Those 4 words meant more to me than the promotion, the salary increase, or the vindication of seeing Charles face the consequences of his actions. They meant that my son still believed in his father, still saw me as someone worth looking up to. Charles Morrison had tried to humiliate me in front of my child, to plant seeds of doubt about my worth and capabilities. Instead, he'd given me the opportunity to show Tommy what real strength looked like. Not the loud, bullying kind that tears others down, but the quiet, determined kind that builds others up while refusing to be intimidated or diminished. A week after Charles's public humiliation of me, I had indeed made him regret it. But more importantly, I'd made sure that my son learned a valuable lesson about courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The company picnic the following year was a very different experience. As vice president of operations, I was one of the executives helping to host the event. Tommy, now 6 and even more confident than before, ran around the park with his friends while I supervised the setup and greeted employees and their families. At one point, as I was checking on the catering arrangements, Tommy came running up to me with his face flushed from playing tag. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson said you're one of the bosses now, is that true?" "Yes, buddy, I'm one of the bosses." "Are you a good boss or a mean boss?" I knelt down to his level, thinking about all the employees who now reported to me, all the decisions I made that affected their livelihoods and job satisfaction. "I try to be a good boss, Tommy. I try to treat people the way I want to be treated." "Like how you treat me?" "Exactly like how I treat you." Tommy nodded approvingly and ran back to his friends. As I watched him go, I realized that Charles Morrison had inadvertently done me the greatest favor of my career. By pushing me to my breaking point, he'd forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, and to take actions that ultimately led to exactly where I was supposed to be. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making someone pay for what they did to you. Sometimes it's about becoming so successful that their attempt to diminish you becomes irrelevant. Charles had called me adequate, had suggested I was out of place at company events, had tried to make my son doubt his father's worth. Now I was running those company events, leading the department he'd once controlled, and raising a son who was proud of his father's integrity and courage. That, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all.